As a novice to Commander, it may be daunting trying to decide which Commander is best to start with. By the end of this video, my hope is you feel comfortable building around any of these 10 Commanders, as I'll be showing you what all 10 want to do to win. I made this list using 7 criteria. I go over each rule and explain why I implemented it at the end, but see if you can guess all 7 along the way. Number 1, Queen Marchesa. Queen Marchesa is a Mardu commander built around the Monarch archetype. This is really good, which is why it paints a target on your back. If you're attacked and dealt combat damage by someone else, they become the Monarch. This deck revolves around being the Monarch. Most of the cards in this deck reap huge rewards from you being the Monarch, and so you have to protect yourself from people trying to steal it. Creatures with Death Touch, as these kill any creature they do damage to. Cards that force the attacker to pay mana if they want to attack you, commonly referred to as Pillow Forts. And goading cards, forcing your opponents to attack whenever they could, but never at you, are staples within the deck. Commander is a political game. I like to think about it more as a board game than the competitive card game everyone thinks of. Part of piloting this deck well comes down to how good of an in-game politician you can be. You can and should strike deals with people across the table to take down the bigger problem or convince someone to leave you alone. It all depends on how trustworthy and persuasive you are, and that's part of the fun of this deck specifically. Queen Marchesa is great because she brings a mechanic that isn't frequently seen to the table, keeping the game pretty fresh. Monarch is inherently a political tool, and it can be nice to have a mechanic that directly promotes that playstyle. This commander won't be for everyone. With red, white, and black as your commander's color identity, combat is a huge part of what this deck wants to do. If you prefer to play a more defensive game, or just want to do wacky stuff with a bunch of spells, then Queen Marchesa is probably not for you. As a raw weakness of Monarch, as I said before, it paints a target on your back. Everyone wants that extra card draw, and you can get focused by the players around you.
However, I think she's a great commander for any beginner because of the interactivity she introduces to pretty much any game.
As with everyone on this list, I expect Queen Marchesa to be relevant for a long time. Number 2, Frodo, Adventurous Hobbit, and Sam, Loyal Attendant. Food life gain. Frodo and Sam are really cool new additions with the Lord of the Rings set. Both cards go in your command zone because of their partner keyword, and you can play them at the same time, giving you access to the Abzan colors of green, black, and white. Life gain is a common archetype for decks with white in their color identity, but rarely is it because of food. With Frodo and Sam, you'll have to work a little bit harder than the average life gain deck. The payoff is a really unique playstyle that you won't find in another commander deck though. It revolves around being unassuming, getting your pieces set up, and then popping off before anyone realizes that you're the problem. In order for this deck to achieve greatness, you'll need to get your engines set up. Think of an engine as A and B, and A plus B equals C, where C is winning the game and A plus B are the specific cards needed to get you there. Sam is a food engine, meaning he will consistently make food tokens with his first ability. His second ability makes food easier to activate for various abilities in the deck, like Frodo's second ability. Frodo is your card draw engine. He'll ensure you're consistently drawing cards to keep the food coming. These two work together in a very flavorful and fluid way. Hobbits love food, Frodo is the ring bearer, and this deck is all about taking the steps necessary to win. The ring bearer is a new mechanic to Magic with Lord of the Rings, where each time you trigger the ring tempting you, the ring gains a new ability. If Frodo is the only thing tempting the ring, then in 4 turns you'll have access to all of its abilities. This deck is a little bit of a grind to pilot, like the Hobbit's journey to Mordor. Anyone who's a fan of this series, though, would enjoy playing Frodo and Sam simply to see the cast of characters included in a deck fully built around the Lord of the Rings cards. This is a really quirky playstyle that requires quite a lot of setup. There will be turns where you aren't super active with the rest of the board and are more focused on getting your engines going. If those get disrupted, rebuilding isn't always smooth. Hobbits are small creatures in Lord of the Rings, and they are the same in Magic, so you really don't have anything to deter someone from setting their sights on you. That's usually where the life gain is important in this deck, because you can just face tank damage and heal it off with your food tokens. This deck is what it is, and more importantly, isn't what it isn't. You have a very distinct game plan that's excellent for beginners to pick up and play once they get the gist of it. As most life gain decks do, Frodo and Sam struggle to end the game through conventional means, so finding an obvious win condition can be just a little bit tricky. Number 10 on this list is almost the exact opposite commander to Frodo and Sam, and also one of their greatest enemies. Keep watching if you're interested in playing the big bads. Number 3, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. Tokens. I think token decks are great for beginners. Your deck is basically always doing something, even if that's just making a few 1/1s each turn, and you've basically always got little cards to block bigger creatures with. Jetmir as a commander is interesting because he doesn't need to be on your board to be effective. He's essentially just there to end the game. Your whole goal is to build a board of creatures and then cast him down the line on turn 7 or 8. Naya, which is green, white, and red, is probably my favorite color combo for beginners due to the relative straightforwardness of what decks in Naya want to do. Whether it's tokens or dinos, Naya eventually becomes too big of a problem to ignore. What I like most about Jetmir for beginners is that he introduces a timer to games. It's not so often that we see outright win conditions on commander cards like we do here. Go-wide token strategies struggle if they can't get going. While Jetmir may be a win condition, if you can't build a board, then he really doesn't provide much help or value otherwise. One call out for Naya is you're lacking some of the trickery that black and blue offer. Your game plan tends to be much more straightforward, hence why I think this deck is pretty great for beginners. However, it can make your options just a bit one-dimensional. Jetmir is great for speeding up games. While he doesn't offer much utility outside of sheer combat threat, that's enough. Having a consistent threat in your command zone is a deadly tool that gives you a lot of flexibility when building your deck. If the idea of building a bunch of small creatures and buffing them up to stampede sounds like fun to you, then Jetmir is a great option. Number 4, Marneus Calgar. Treasure tokens. Marneus Calgar was my first commander, and he's my go-to whenever I play. The opposite of Jetmir, Calgar wants to stay on the battlefield and accrue value by drawing you lots of cards. Esper, which is white, blue, and black, is a really dynamic color trio. You have excellent removal, some of the best card draw in the game, and generally have a way to interact with the board at any given point in a game. Calgar is an incredibly versatile commander. You can play him as a white-heavy tokens commander, a black-heavy aristocrats commander, an equipment or artifacts commander, or just my personal favorite, a treasure commander. Right out of the gate, Calgar's card draw is ridiculous. Token creation is so easy and common nowadays, you'll sometimes get tokens from your opponent's removal spells. He even has a built-in token ability in case you are having trouble getting going. Double Strike is a nifty keyword. It makes him difficult to block since the first 3 damage is dealt like he had First Strike. You've got a lot of options with his built-in card draw, and he's incredibly self-sufficient. You draw a lot of cards with it and have access to mana instantly with your treasures. For this space pirate, it's a lot of fun. As for weaknesses, Calgar is a big part of this deck. If he gets removed, it can be difficult to see the deck thrive, as I know it can. Similarly to Frodo and Sam, the treasure variant of Calgar isn't as simple as creating 1/1 tokens and smacking people in the face like Jetmir does. Treasure Calgar requires a fair bit of nuance, and the win conditions are just a bit more complex. Tokens are a huge part of Commander, so you'll have no issues updating this deck with cool new stuff in the future. If Calgar sounds cool, stay tuned till number 7 because I've got another Esper commander you'll definitely be interested in. Number 5, Animar, Soul of Elements. +1/+1 counters. I know I said no Izzet or Simic, but I figured combining the 3 is bending the rules enough to be somewhat fair or completely broken. As a beginner, Animar Soul of Elements looks like a weird inclusion as a 1/1 creature. Surely Animar can't be that strong, right? Animar makes this deck run wild when he's allowed to stay on the battlefield. Having built-in protection from the 2 best removal colors in the game is a huge upside and makes that much easier. Animar can't be targeted by things like Swords to Plowshares or Fatal Push. Animar's archetype is simple. It's what's called a +1/+1 counter deck. It wants to put +1/+1 counters on Animar to get your creatures out for cheap, especially spells that have X in their mana cost, as you're automatically adding 1 to X for every +1/+1 counter on Animar. Within Temur, which is blue, red, and green, you're going to be ramping out big creatures more than basically any other color combo. Simic, which is blue and green, and Gruul, which is red and green, are prolific for their ability to ramp, which means getting out bigger creatures earlier using things like Mana Dorks, which tap for mana, Mana Rocks, like Soul Ring, and getting out lands faster. This deck is likely the strongest of any on this list. Animar isn't just hard to deal with. It pumps out huge creatures that are equally as dangerous. If you want to play a deck with big creatures in it, this is the deck for you. This commander is scary, and scary usually equals you get focused. So expect people to work together to bring you down before you can get set up. This is what's known as being the arch nemesis or arch enemy. If you like the idea of big creatures, look no further. I'm a huge fan of Hydras myself over stuff like Dinos and Dragons, and there are plenty of Hydras that can be added into this deck. Number 6, Teysa Karlov, Aristocrats. Teysa Karlov is an Orzhov, which means white and black commander, perfectly designed for aristocrats. An aristocrat strategy aims to sacrifice your own creatures to do damage to people using what's commonly called a blood artist effect. This usually revolves around creating tokens to use as fodder for your various sacrifice outlets. It's not easy to kill an aristocrats player. We're usually building a board full of token creatures to summarily sacrifice, but using them as blockers usually accomplishes the same goal. Your blood artists don't care how creatures die. It's a lose-lose for anyone trying to attack an aristocrats player. Similar to Jetmir, if you struggle to build a board, then it's hard to get Teysa Karlov going. Luckily, she's pretty good at stalling for time by giving her creatures lifelink and vigilance. Trigger doublers like Teysa Karlov have lots of triggers. This can be a bit difficult to track for new players, but it just comes with practice. If the idea of sacrificing stuff sounds fun and/or you like vampires, then Teysa Karlov is probably a great fit for you. Number 8 is another Orzhov commander if you want to see a different style of this color combo, so stick around till then. Number 7, Alela, Artful, Provocateur. Unnatural. Another Esper commander, Alela Artful Provocateur is best built with an unnatural deck. Unnatural combines the artifact and enchantment archetypes with her third ability to churn out 1/1 tokens with flying that immediately get buffed +1/+0 with her second ability. The deck has a big focus on flyers in the 99, and Alela herself has flying, death touch, and lifelink, making her a pretty efficient body on your board. People hate swinging their big creatures into defenders with death touch. As I said in the breakdown, this deck really focuses on flyers in the 99. Creatures with flying are really hard to stop unless someone else is playing a deck like dragons, angels, or just any other flyers. You'll be doing lots of damage pretty much as soon as your board gets online. This Esper deck is much more of a control deck than Calgar's. Fairies are tricky creatures, and this deck thrives when an opportune counterspell swings momentum back in Alela's favor. She can build an army of flyers to then throw at someone's face. Artifacts and enchantments are a whole world of utility, and with 3 colors, you've got a ton of options to pick from. Maybe you want to play a more defensive game. Focus on cards like Sphere of Safety and Mithril Coat. There are tons of +1/+1 counter enchantments you can play around with, or you can go crazy with something like a Shark Typhoon. Maybe lean into some aristocrats with Bolas's Citadel, or make huge flyers with the Helm of the Gods. You can play Alela a few different ways, and having creative options like that is really cool. There are lots of cards that specifically give artifact and enchantment players a hard time, and you're playing both. Something like a Kasali Slingers completely shuts down your deck, and it can be difficult to recover if it's allowed to stay on the board, and that's just one example. This deck doesn't struggle too much against board wipes since artifacts and enchantments are generally safe from them, but as with any deck that wants to go wide with lots of small creatures, it's something to be extra considerate of. Save those counter spells for people who are giving you their full attention. Flying decks by nature are difficult to defend against, and that's what makes you a target. If you enjoy the idea of playing tricky magic, Esper is a great color combo for you. If dragons interest you, there are plenty you can play, and Alela herself is a pretty cool creature card. If you see yourself as a more casual player and don't want to play blue, a very control-focused color, then maybe Alela isn't for you. However, if you are a fan of control decks and want to go even harder, then for sure check out number 10 on this list like I mentioned earlier. Number 8. Eriette of the Charmed Apple. Aura Enchantments. Eriette of the Charmed Apple is a new commander who has a similar archetype to Alela with enchantment auras. These are similar to regular old enchantments, except they target a specific permanent, kind of like equipments. You gain value from these through her second ability. Each opponent loses life, and you gain life equal to your auras. Eriette is strong. What I like most about her is that you're a tabletop general. The auras you play heavily dictate what people can do without removing anything on the board. Not only that, but anything enchanted by an aura you control can't attack you. She's the evil witch working behind the scenes, like a demented Disney movie. This isn't a weakness in terms of power level, but this deck has a lot of triggers. A trigger is an ability that activates when a condition is met, such as a card entering the battlefield. We talked about this a little bit with Teysa Karlov. For new players and even seasoned players, this can be hard to manage. Missing triggers happens, so make sure you have a strong understanding of what each card is, and maybe arrange them on your board so you know specific cards need more attention than others. Orzhov is my favorite color duo, which is probably why you see so much of it on this list. My opinion is that it's an excellent color pairing for beginners due to how sturdy it is from life gain effects and the various archetypes within the color pair. As for the deck, Eriette is a much more aggressive enchantment commander than you'll usually find. She's constantly draining your opponents while throwing out distractions to keep them preoccupied. This deck plays with a bit more focus on impacting the board around you versus just putting the blinders on and building a board of tokens. Number 9. The Wise Mothman. Mill. The Wise Mothman is maybe the most complicated card on this list, but that's only because of how it's worded. First off, rad counters are a new mechanic to the Fallout set. The card itself doesn't say what they do, but the effect is pretty simple. At the beginning of each player's main phase, they mill cards equal to the number of rad counters they have. For each non-land card milled, that player loses 1 life and removes a rad counter. When someone mills, that's just taking the card off the top of their deck and putting it in their graveyard. The second ability builds off your opponent's milling cards. Pretty simple once you've seen it in action or just tried it yourself a few times. This deck is all about milling yourself and opponents to either kill them with rad damage or go for something like a Rise of the Dark Realms. I wanted to include a graveyard or mill deck in this list because it's a great resource to get used to using. Usually the biggest drawback for graveyard decks is they are easily hamstrung if their graveyard is exiled. That's not entirely the case with the Wise Mothman because of his rad counters. Rad counters allow you to stack up damage each turn and also open the possibility of milling your opponents to death. If your opponents can't draw a card when they otherwise have to, they lose. You're building this deck to fill graveyards and use those like a second, third, fourth, and fifth hand. As I mentioned, if your graveyard isn't getting filled, then this deck can struggle. Same as if you can't get those rad counters down on opponents. Rad counters are also a new mechanic, so you don't have a ton of variety for card options yet. Finally, Mothman's ability triggers when he ETBs and while attacking. Attack triggers on a commander can be scary because you're inherently putting your commander at risk. Mothman has flying to make this easier, but if he's not attacking, you're not stacking rad counters. There's a reason so many precon commanders show up on this list. Their design has only gotten more and more streamlined for the commander format, and they're far more accessible to build. Even if you're not that interested in Fallout as a franchise, take a look at the Wise Mothman if you're interested in building a graveyard deck. Number 10, Lord of the Nazgul. Cantrips. Card draw is the strongest mechanic in any card game. Let's build a deck that's whole goal is to draw cards. The Cantrips archetype is a deck that wants to draw cards to create some kind of value. In Lord of the Nazgul, that value comes from playing instants and sorceries that draw you cards. Draw cards, make a 3/3 Wraith. It's a net positive in every way. This deck only gets stronger with time. Once you've got 9 Wraiths, not just the tokens, just any creature that's a Wraith, they become 9/9s. On the way to getting those 9 Wraiths, you were likely drawing plenty of options in Jetmir, which is blue and black, to protect your board at the same time. There's a reason I begin building my decks around card draw sources. Drawing cards is just fun. You get to see more of your deck, which is pretty cool in a format like Commander, where you can only have one of each card in the deck, and you'll usually see less than 25% of it in the game. As for weaknesses, maybe price. You can include up to 9 Nazgul in the 99 of your deck, which I know goes against what I was just talking about with this singleton Commander format, but that's just on the rules text of the card. This can make your deck a little bit expensive. You don't have to have them, but they certainly make the deck better. Having an immediate upside to drawing cards like Lord of the Nazgul offers is the making of a timeless commander. Power creep will inevitably touch every deck, but when a big part of this deck revolves around simply playing instant and sorcery card draw, pretty future-proof. We've got lots of blue and black on this list. I promise I'm not a control player. These decks just looked like good fits for beginners while fitting within my parameters for this video. Now that we've reached the end, let me explain how I came to this list of 10 commanders for beginners. I only looked at the top 100 commanders on EDHREC when building this list. When I started recording this video, there were 2,278 commanders you can choose from. That's a lot. I wanted to narrow the field, but also didn't want to dig too deep into obscurity. I started at the top, and who knows, maybe the next video will be 101 to 200. I wanted each commander to be 2 to 3 colors because monocolored decks can be a bit linear, and 4 to 5 color decks are expensive choices when you start upgrading your lands. My personal preference is 3 colored commanders because that third color opens up a lot of design options for your deck. But I think 2 color commanders are best for beginners because they're a little more consistent on a budget. My stance on typal decks is they are probably the best place for beginners to start, but they're also the most obvious type of deck to play. Slam some creatures that all share a type, buff them up, and swing it. Nothing wrong with that, and I've got a few typal decks myself. However, typal decks don't play all that different from game to game. I wanted to introduce unique strategies to consider, and if there's a creature type you really enjoy the idea of, I highly recommend you start by building a commander deck around them. You'll find that all 10 commanders on this list support different archetypes, that is, the main strategy of the deck. I wanted to include as much variety as I could, which is why each commander had to do something different on this list. You won't find any Izzet, which are red-blue decks on this list, because they're primarily a spellslinger archetype that trends toward being very combo heavy. Combos tend to lead to complexity. You also won't find stuff like Wheels, which force your opponents to discard their hand and is generally considered less fun to play against. No overly complex or mean archetypes here. Lastly, there is no Simic. Blue and green together are all about ramping as fast as possible and drawing an excess amount of cards. It's a great strategy for beginners because the deck hardly struggles to be efficient, but it's not always the most realistic version of Magic. Learning how to build around weaknesses is a great building block for beginner commander players, and I just don't think Simic has many weaknesses. In conclusion, my honest opinion is that the best commander for you, a beginner Magic player, is whichever deck most excites you. My goal was to pull together some fun options with lots of variety that were noob friendly, both complexity and price-wise, without including typal decks. Let me know what you think is a great beginner commander in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Peace.